Well, obviously, Tim Keller does not need an introduction, or you wouldn't have been lined up at 5:30 to get in here. So I don't want to give much of an introduction other than he is the founding pastor of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, PCA church that shares a heartbeat with Belhaven University. Came in 1989 after two others had turned down the invitation for the assignment to take on a congregation of 50 people, and has built it to one of the most influential churches in the world. Not just in New York City, but its reach all around the world. I've especially appreciated Dr. Keller's involvement these last number of months with the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization, where I put a lot of my energy and heart, and I have seen Dr. Keller, through his writing and through his speaking, have great passion in so many important areas for the world and for the megacities, especially articulates the message for the city more than anybody else, more wonderfully than anybody else, but also has a great passion not just for cities, but for the arts, for the poor, for the life of the mind, and for complex issues. Dr. Keller does it and shares it with grace, generosity of spirit, and biblical truth, and that's where we are thankful for his ministry. Would you welcome Dr. Tim Keller?
Well, I'm honored and humbled to have people waiting to see me, and it's delightful to be here. And I haven't been in Jackson in a fairly long time. I wrote a book, and the book is based on the Gospel of Mark. But of course, at a time like this, when you write a book, the question that continually comes to you is, why did you write the book, and why did you think it was important to write? It's pretty simple. I'm trying to tell the true story of Jesus from the Gospel of Mark, the true story of Jesus. And I'm going to tell you three things: why it's important that the story of Jesus is true, why it's important that the story of Jesus is about Jesus, and why it's important that the Gospel is not a set of bullet points, but a story. And I think my guess is no matter who you are, there'll be something here that'll be of help. First of all, it's really important now to realize that the story of Jesus that we have in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's a true story. 120 years ago, it was confidently asserted by an awful lot of scholars that the New Testament Gospels were essentially a set of oral traditions that had evolved over time, that had been doctored by the early church, been passed down, and finally written down 100 years after the events of Jesus' life or more. And therefore, we really had no idea just whether we knew much at all from the Bible about what really happened, what Jesus really said, or what he really did. We really can't tell. It's legend. How much is historical, we don't know. Now, even when and I'm old enough now, even when I was first a college student in the late 60s, there was already beginning a kind of begrudging admission that the New Testament Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were all written within somewhere like 40 or 50 years after. They were written down 40 or 50 years after the events of Jesus' life. That's a little bit like, again, I'm thinking of my age here. I went to college 40 years ago. And it's hard for some of you to understand, but I can still remember college very, very well. And most of the people I went to college with are still alive too. And it really wouldn't be all that difficult for us to get together, pull our memories, and write down fairly accurate accounts of things that happened. And increasingly, scholarships had to admit that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses. And yet, you still have a pretty stubborn conviction on the part of an awful lot of scholars and an awful lot of parts of the academia that basically still what we have in the New Testament is not history. It's something that is been encrusted by legend. It was kind of it was kind of formed by the leaders of the early church who were trying to promote their particular policies, and therefore we can't trust it. And yet, honestly, even in my 40 years, actually, since being a college student, it's pretty obvious to see that increasingly there's more and more evidence that even people who aren't faithful believers, just objective observers, there's more and more evidence that what you have in the New Testament is not, the Gospels are not oral traditions so much as they're oral histories. They're eyewitness accounts. I'd like to give you 8 arguments, real quick, on why when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're not looking at legend, you're looking at eyewitness accounts that really happen, of what really happened. I'll give you 8 arguments. You can get these in older books like F.F. Bruce's books on the New Testament documents, or Paul Barnett, or Craig Blomberg, or more recently Richard Bauckham's great book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. But here they are. It's very, very important. First of all, there's a guy that maybe you're supposed to pronounce his name Papias, and maybe you're supposed to call him Papias, I don't know. But he was an early Christian bishop. And Richard Bauckham brings out the fact that he wrote that when he was a young man in 80 AD, when he was a young man, there were 3 generations still alive. You had the original eyewitnesses that knew Jesus and saw Jesus, heard Jesus, saw the things that he did. You had the elders that sat at the feet of the eyewitnesses, and you had the disciples of the elders. 3 generations. And Papias said that when he was a young man, all 3 generations were still there. There's still lots and lots of eyewitnesses that were still around. And he pointed out that the eyewitnesses, the people who had seen Jesus and knew Jesus, that they took up residence in many of the prominent churches of that time, and their eyewitness accounts were honored, and they often told the story, and they were passed on. And eyewitnesses were very much a very important part of the life of the early church, which meant there was a kind of regulator on the development of legends in those first few decades, because the eyewitnesses were there and they knew what happened. Just like, in a sense, if I was getting my college buddies together to try to write about what happened on the campus of Bucknell University in 1970 when we had the big strike because of the Cambodia invasion. And if somebody came along even now and started writing about the fact that bombs went off on the campus during that time, all of us who were there would say, no, and such stories wouldn't get off the ground. But Pius says eyewitnesses were extremely important in the life of the early church. That's very important testimony. Argument 1. Argument 2. There's 4 Gospels. Why? Wouldn't one biography of Jesus be enough? But the point is, eyewitness testimony is always selective. The eyewitnesses only tell you what they saw. And therefore, if you really want a good account of what happened, you have to get a number of eyewitness accounts together, and therefore multiple eyewitness accounts is the normal way in which you get a clear picture of what's going on. And the fact that the early church even had 4 Gospels, Richard Bauckham says, is a testimony to the fact that these were understood to be eyewitness accounts. If you just really wanted a kind of legendary narrative of Jesus that you sort of pieced together, you only would have needed 1. They wanted 4. And one of the reasons was because they were eyewitness accounts. Third argument. The Gospels themselves say they are. Beginning of the book of Luke, Luke says to the person he's writing to, Theophilus, he says, I pieced this together, I put this account of Jesus' life together by talking to eyewitnesses, the people who were really there. That's normal historiographical language in ancient times. That's the way a historian would begin his account and say, this isn't just something I made up out of my head. I didn't just go around and find stories and piece them together. I'm not a myth maker, I'm an historian, and that's what Luke is saying he is. Argument 4, the names. Why is it that in Mark, Bartimaeus, the blind man who was healed, Salome, a number of people are named, but when you get to Matthew and Luke, and these were probably Gospels that were written a little bit later than Mark, a lot of those people don't have names. Or why is it that Malchus is the name of the Roman soldier that has his ear cut off in the Garden of Gethsemane, but in the other, he's not named in the other Gospels? Why? Richard Bauckham particularly makes a great case. He looks at all the reasons why some of the Gospels name people. Or, for example, on the road to Emmaus, only one of the disciples, there's 2 disciples that Jesus meets, right? Only one is named. Now, see, if you're making a story up, you name neither of them or you name one of them. Why only, or both of them, but you don't name just one of them? Or in Mark, when Jesus is on the way to Calvary, under the weight of his cross, and he can't carry it. And in Mark chapter 15, we're told that they just grabbed a man, Simon of Cyrene, and made him carry the cross. And then Mark adds, they made Simon of Cyrene carry the cross, and it says, yes, the father of Rufus and Alexander. Rufus and Alexander never come into the story. They're never mentioned again. What possible reason would Mark give to say Rufus and Alexander? He's talking as if people would know who Rufus and Alexander are. And Richard Bauckham in his book points out that this is just the historian's way of saying, if you want to check, go talk to Rufus and Alexander. I mean, their dad's gone now, but you can talk to them, and they knew. See, this was it was essentially the names in the Gospels are like footnotes for us today. When we make a footnote, it's our way of saying, don't trust me, go read the source. And those were footnotes. Let me give you a fifth argument. The unnecessary detail. In the book of John, you know the story about how the risen Christ appears to Peter, James, and John. They're out in a boat, and Jesus appears on the shore, and they're out in the boat, and they can't quite tell who it is. And he calls to them, and he says, put your nets down and bring in a catch. And they put the nets down. They bring in this enormous catch of fish, and they realize who it is. And then Peter runs out of the boat, and goes to see Jesus. But in the process, it says they brought the catch of fish in, and they said there were 153 fish. 153. Okay. So this is a legend, right? So if it's a legend, everything has been in there to be symbolic. I actually read commentators who say, what is the meaning of the symbolism of 153 fish? Did it represent the fact that in the Roman church, the Church of Rome at that time, there were 153 elders and stuff like that? No, the reason why it mentioned 153 fish was because there were. There's no other reason to put it in. There is no other reason to put it in. When you're making things up, you don't just throw in little details like that have no help. They don't develop the character. They don't move the plot along. It's just what the guy remembered. Whoever was probably maybe John himself. He was supposed to be there. There's one place where C.S. Lewis, who knew quite a bit about literature, whenever he used to read people saying that the Gospels are legends, he knew right away they don't read like legends. He actually says at one place in one of his works, he says, something will have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. He says, I was a professional literary critic, and I think I know the difference between legend and historical writing. The Gospels are not legends. In one sense, they're not good enough. Now, by the way, it sure looks like a put down, but you know what he's saying. He says, sorry, legends are more artful. These are clearly, and here's what he says. He says, if they are not history, then they are a realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. Little episodes such as Jesus writing in the dust when they brought him the woman taken in adultery, which have no doctrinal significance at all, are the mark. See what he's saying? He says, whenever you have this stuff that's just thrown in, like the 153 fish, you say, wait a minute, what's that there for? And the answer is, somebody just remembered it. Eyewitness account has vividness, it has vantage point, it is extremely selective. And it has and the Gospels have all the marks of being a real eyewitness account of what really happened. Let me go on a little further. Another argument in favor of the fact that this is the true story, it really happened, is that so many of the things that happen in the Gospels are incredibly inconvenient for church leaders. The theory is that the early church created many of the sayings of Jesus, created many of the statements of Jesus and the stories of Jesus in order to support their policies. That's the idea. That's the reason why so many scholars are skeptical. They say you can't trust what the Bible says about Jesus because that's the early church letting you know what they want you to know about Jesus. My word, if that's true, they were utterly incompetent. They should have hired a better marketing department. First of all, one of the more famous ones is this. In the first century, when women had such low status, social status, that their testimony was not admissible evidence in court. That was true in the Roman courts. That was true in the Jewish jurisprudence. Women are the first people that see Jesus. In every gospel, they're the first people that see Jesus. Now, if you're creating a story in that time and place to promote the credibility of the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, you would never make women the first witnesses. And if they are the first witnesses in those accounts, the only possible reasonable explanation that they are is because they were. And that the writers had to put it in because they were. It would have been much better to cover it up, but they couldn't because that's what happened. Or even the fact, here's Peter, and just as Jesus is dying, they come up to him and say, "Weren't you with him?" And 3 times he denies. 3 times he lies to save his own skin. And at the last time, in order to really deflect suspicion, the last time they say, "Surely you're one of his disciples," he calls down curses. I've read a couple of commentators that say you can't quite exactly be sure, but curses on who? Maybe he was cursing himself, but it's much more likely he might have been calling down a curse on Jesus himself as a way of saying, see, a real disciple would never do something like that. Peter looks terrible in the Gospels, utterly horrible. And actually, there's an awful lot of other places. Peter sees Jesus transfigured. I was at a bookstore yesterday, and a relatively skeptical person asked a question and said, look, there's some things about the Bible that just don't make sense. And he said, here you have the transfiguration. Peter saw Jesus transfigured. He saw Moses appear. He saw Elijah appear. And next thing you know, after all that's done, he's still acting like a jerk. He's still denying. He's still doing all the. He says, that doesn't make any sense. And I said, that's proof that's an eyewitness account. If you're making that up, you'd never have Peter talking like that. Not only that, if you're trying to promote, Peter was one of the main leaders of the church. If you're trying to promote the church, you would never have the main leader. In an honor and shame cultures, those were honor and shame cultures, to have a leader call down curses or like that, that is a man who should never have been the leader of a movement. What's most amazing and touching to me is that the only possible reason that story about Peter's denial was in the Bible would have been because Peter authorized it. Peter had to have been the source of it. Only Peter knew what happened. And Peter, being the leader, must have authorized people telling about it. That shows how transformed he was by the risen Christ, how utterly changed his self-image was. What a humbled man he was, and yet how loved he must have felt that he didn't care. There's just too much in the New Testament that is incredibly inconvenient for the leaders of the early church. It almost proves, it's strong evidence that these were really eyewitness accounts. And let me give you, actually, I'm going to got to move on. Let me just give you one more argument. I still talk to people today that say you can't trust the New Testament because it was not written by detached, objective observers. It was written, the eyewitnesses were converts. The eyewitnesses were passionate believers in Jesus. You can't trust them. Richard Bauckham in his book says, so are you going to say to every Holocaust survivor who was actually in the camp, saw it, and then got released later, are they detached observers? Are they passionate? Are they involved? Yes. Are you going to say, well, we can't trust anything they say? Of course not. Of course you're going to trust what they say. And if you actually saw the resurrection, do you think you could possibly stay detached? Of course not. On the other hand, it doesn't mean they're wrong. Listen, the New Testament is true. I don't know whether maybe most of you don't have doubts about it, but that's what you need to understand. You cannot wiggle out from under what the New Testament says about Jesus by saying, well, who knows if it ever really happened? And if you already believe that, then there's a little bit of ammunition to help in talking to your friends. Secondly, though, it's very important that we see that the Gospels is a true story, not about something in general, but Jesus himself. There's 2 ways, I think, to find faith. The one way I've found over the years is to go the path that I trod in The Reason for God. There's an awful lot of people that have philosophical objections. They've got real strong intellectual objections to the very idea that Christianity could be true. And they will not let you talk about the substance of Christianity. Their eyes will glaze over if you start to actually positively expound it. You've got to deal with their objections. And that's what I do in The Reason for God. I take more of a arguments, philosophical approach. But I must tell you, there's another way through the doubts into belief, and that is just to expose people to the compelling person of Christ himself. Just to let them see. That's why this book was written. And I don't care whether you've got doubts about Christianity, just take a look at Jesus. Dick Lucas, pastor in St. Helen's Church for many years in London. Years ago, somebody came to Dick and said, Pastor, I would believe in God if you could just give me a watertight argument. I'm just waiting for Christians to give me one watertight argument, and then I can believe in God. And Dick said, but what if God didn't give us a watertight argument? Instead, he gave us a watertight person against whom, in the end, there can be no argument. And the guy said, what do you mean by that? Read about Jesus. Look at him. Now that you know that this is the real guy who actually lived and walked on this earth, now that you can see it's an eyewitness account, now look at him. And when you see him, you're going to see two things. There have been people in the past that claimed to be God. And there have been people in the past who were unbelievably loving, unbelievably kind, incredible spiritual leaders, wise, tender, humble, astonishing in their character, their love, their joy, their peace, their patience, their kindness, their goodness, their self-control. I mean, there have been people who've claimed to be God, and there have been people who have had these incredibly virtuous lives, the Mother Teresa kind of lives. But never in history have you had the two combined. The people who claim to be God are not kind and sweet and melt-in-your-mouth beautiful. They're there. They've been around. And the people who are melt-in-your-mouth beautiful never claim to be God. But here's Jesus. They let a paralytic down, right? There's friends of the paralytic tear the roof apart, lower him down so Jesus will heal him. He walks up and he says, my son, Jesus says, your sins are forgiven. And all the people there are astounded, and many of the religious leaders are offended, and rightly so, in a way. Because, if I walk up to Ligon Duncan and I punch him in the nose, and then the guy next to him says, Tim, I forgive you for punching Ligon in the nose. Ligon will say, excuse me, but only I can forgive Tim for punching me in the nose. You can't forgive Tim. That's right. You can only forgive something if it's against you. Do you know what Jesus is saying when he goes all around forgiving everybody for all their sins? He's saying all sins are against me. And that's just the beginning of the stuff he says. There's one offhanded place where he says, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. What? I mean, I don't know what his disciples said. What? When was that? I mean, he says he's going to judge the world. There has never been a combination of anyone who's ever made claims like that and lived a life like that. And that's why Dick says, it's a watertight argument. No, it's a watertight person against whom in the end there can be no argument. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He says, when you really look at Jesus, you realize nobody could have made this man up. Nobody could have made him up. So it's a true story. It's a true story about Jesus. But lastly, I'd like to point out that the Gospels that we have are not sets of bullet points. I mean, we live in a very, very, I don't know what kind of age. We live in an impatient age. And we want people to be direct. We want to know exactly. And we want bullet points. We want, overhead projector, bullet points quickly. And the Gospel's not a set of bullet points. The Gospels are a story. Here's the reason why it's so important. I've always been so impressed with how J.R.R. Tolkien led his atheist friend C.S. Lewis toward faith in Christianity. You know, J.R.R. Tolkien and Lewis were both teachers at Oxford. Lewis was a lecturer. Tolkien was a full professor, a little older. Tolkien was a very devout Catholic Christian believer. Lewis was an atheist. And one day, walking on Addison's Walk along the River Cherwell by Lewis's rooms, Tolkien made an evangelistic move that basically laid the foundation for that atheist becoming a believer. And I've always been amazed. You want to know what it is? To understand it, you got to go to Tolkien's not that easy to read, but absolutely crucial to read essay called On Fairy Stories. One of the things that he says on fairy stories that I think is amazing to me is what he calls secondary belief. He says when somebody tells you a story and you know it really happened, that's primary belief. But when someone tells you a story that you know is fictional, you know it's fiction, but it's so well told, and the characters are so well developed, and the plot is so well developed too, that even though you might sit there at the movie or listen to read the book and you're really kind of indifferent, yet you get drawn in, right? You get scared. You get happy. Because if the story is well told, Tolkien said, then the story commands what he calls secondary belief. It draws you in. It makes you have the feelings as if, to some degree, it was true. You get just as scared, even though you know it's not true, but you're scared for that character. And you care about that character. And you're excited when you see the resolution. He calls that secondary belief. Okay? First thing, it's very important. Then he goes along and says, there's a kind of story that human beings, even today, we live in a secular realm, a secular time, a scientific time, and the leading lights of modern literature have been telling us, you know, life is meaningless, then you die. And yet, Tolkien says, we still crave a certain kind of story. We crave it in movies, we crave it in books. And these are stories that depict a supernatural world. We're just fascinated by those stories. That depict being able to cheat death, escape aging and time. Stories that show us a love that is eternal. A love without parting, a love that overcomes death. We want stories about good absolutely triumphing over evil, destroying evil. See? We love stories about victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, or sacrificial heroism that brings life out of certain death. And we pay money to watch those movies, and we pay money to read about those stories. And you know, the modern literati hate those. They're myths, they're legends, they're fairy stories, they're fairy tales, basically. And modern people say, life is not like that. But Tolkien points out the fact that these are deep human longings. And for some reason, human beings, even in our day and time, want the kind of stories that are very, very well told, that evoke secondary belief, that catch you up in them, that tell you that good will triumph over evil, that there is a supernatural world, that you're not stuck in time, that there is love without parting, that there is a way of escaping death. Now, Tolkien said, why would people still feel this way? Now, what Tolkien's about to say here, I can't prove from the Bible, but it fits in with the Bible. He says, we're made in the image of God, but we're fallen. And therefore, weirdly enough, human beings know at the fact level, we all do have to die. That evil often triumphs. That no matter how much you love somebody, eventually you're going to lose that person. Or they're going to lose you. And we know at the factual level, and we also are told at the factual level, there's no supernatural. So at the factual level, there's no supernatural. We're going to die. There's no escape. Good is not going to triumph at the factual level. And yet underneath, he says, all human beings feel, but there shouldn't be death. We're not meant to die. We're not meant to lose our loved ones. Good should be triumphing over evil. See, there ought to be a supernatural world. We shouldn't be just stuck in time and then we're dead. that at a deeper level, we feel like this is how reality ought to be. In fact, that's the reason why Tolkien believed that even though fairy stories at the factual level aren't true, most people feel in some ways they are true. They point to an underlying reality that's almost more true than the way life is actually being lived in this world. And that's the reason why we still pay good money to see that's the reason why the happy endings, that's the reason why the heroic sacrifices that bring good out of, triumph out of defeat and all that, that's what we still want to watch. We don't want to read Ulysses. See? We don't want to read high literature that's nice and nihilistic, because that's the way life really is. We say, well, maybe it is, but it shouldn't be. And that's the reason why the popular stories tend to be like fairy tales. And so C.S. Lewis, though he was an atheist, really, really, really felt the power of the myths and the legends and the fairy tales, and he loved them. But, he said, even though they point to a kind of what life ought to be like, they're really not. They're not true. And as he was walking along with Tolkien that day, he said something like this. He said, yes, but myths, fairy tales, are lies, though breathed through silver. Myths are lies, even though they're breathed through silver. As beautiful as they are, as much as they point to the way I think the life really ought to be, they're just the lies. And Tolkien said, no, they're not. And he says, here's why I'd say they're not. Look at the gospel. Look at the story of Jesus. Do you realize what you have there? Everything that moves you about a story. Escape from death. A love that conquers death. Good triumphing over evil. Heroic self-sacrifice. And when everything looks the darkest, life out of death. Triumph out of victory, out of defeat. Everything you want in a story. Lewis said, yes, it's true. But he says, I want you to see something. The gospel story of Jesus is not one more wonderful story pointing to the underlying reality. Rather, Jesus is the underlying reality to which all the stories point. And the reason we know that is because of the resurrection. See, Tolkien says the resurrection is what happened. The resurrection was this underlying reality breaking into this world. And the way life ought to be, and the way life is, Jesus Christ is our great captain. He's opened a cleft in the pitiless walls of the world. He's punched a hole through that concrete slab between life as it is and life as it ought to be, between the ideal and the real. And now, because of the resurrection proves that the cross was not a defeat, it was a triumph. It proves that Jesus made satisfaction for sins. It proves that now God can come into your life. It proves that now Jesus can come into your life because he's alive. He says, take a look at the evidence for the resurrection. He basically said that. The resurrection means that Jesus is not one more beautiful story that makes you feel good for a while, and then the lights dim and you walk out into the real world. Jesus Christ is the underlying reality to which all the stories point, breaking into our world. And that's the reason why there's a place where, in the fairy tale, on fairy stories, Tolkien says this. He says, the peculiar quality of the joy in a successful fairy tale can be explained as a sudden glimpse of an underlying reality, but the Gospels contain a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of those wonderful fairy stories. The Gospels contain the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe, which is the good catastrophe. And a catastrophe is the old Greek word for a world-changing turn. He says, the story of the gospel has entered history and the primary world. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The whole story ends in joy. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true than Jesus' life, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. Émile Callier was a professor of philosophy at Princeton Seminary, and he tells a story of how he actually found faith. He was an agnostic, went off to World War I. He was an agnostic. He didn't really believe in God. He was into philosophy. He was kind of skeptical about the whole idea of religion. But during World War I, he had an experience like a lot of other World War I people. He actually had, one of his best friends was talking to him right next to him about his mother, died like that with a bullet in his chest. Later on, a bullet hit him. He was in the hospital for a while. And he realized, even though he was an agnostic and he still wasn't sure if he believed in God, he realized that to really make sense of this world and this life, he was going to need more help than just his skeptical philosophy. So he started reading poetry, and he started reading books, he started reading things, and every so often he would find a passage in this book or this writer or this author that really seemed to make sense to him. And he said, in his this account, he said, I began to long for a book that understood me. I began to long for a book that understood me. And he came up with an idea. He bought a leather-bound little diary, blank place, and he said every single time he read something that seemed to make sense to him and help him, he was going to copy it down. And after about a year, he hoped that he would someday sit down and open it up and read page after page, and I'd finally have a book that made sense of my life and made sense of the world and gave me the joy I was looking for. And after he worked on it for a year or two, one day he went out and sat under a tree and got his book out, and as he read it for the first time, just to read it through for the first time, he was deeply disappointed. He realized he'd already changed. And so some of the things that really hit him a year ago didn't hit him anymore. And he realized that he himself was a moving target, that any book he compiled or any book he wrote would be sort of like a gun pointed here, and then he would move. And he said, I realized I was never going to find a book that understood me. That very day, as he was sitting under the tree, his wife was out walking their little infant child, and along the way had talked to a French Huguenot pastor who had given her a Bible in French. And they didn't have a Bible in the house, and she thought it would be a good idea. He brought it back, and he saw it, and he said, give that to me. And he began reading the Gospels. He said, I read all night, almost all night. And I actually realized, as I was looking at the one the Gospel was written about, that here finally I have a book that's alive and a book that understands me. But it's not just a book that understands me. He went into the Word of the Lord to find the Lord of the Word, Jesus Christ. The true story of Jesus. That's what the world needs. That's what you need. Mr. President, would you please come and close us? Thank you.
In a moment, we're going to have a prayer of benediction, and as we do, we want to pray for Dr. Keller and his ministry of writing as it goes around the world. The significance of this church. I do want to say quickly, we're so thankful you could come tonight. Thankful for our Board of Trustees being here. Many of them are here. Rick Canada, president of Reformed Seminaries here. Rob Perrigan, our new friend, president of Millsaps. Lots of pastors with us tonight, and some of our students are with us tonight. And this is part of our chapel series. We didn't require this of our students, or you wouldn't have had a place to sit. Because on Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock, we fill this place for chapel every week as we come together to worship. But when we have chapel, we conclude every service the same way, with a benediction that we say aloud together of a scripture verse. And I want to invite you to do that this evening as we pray this benediction for Dr. Keller and for his writing and for his work. And I believe it's on the screen. Will you say this prayer of benediction with me together? No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him.